The Nintendo Switch was released the March of 2017, approximately a full half-decade ago already. Time flies when you're having fun, and the Switch has provided an abundant amount of that over the years, with its wide array of stellar games, all playable on both your TV or portably. Hey, how's it going? I'm Josh from 91Tech, and while it's been 5 years, I'm still absolutely blown away that we have a portable device today that's capable of playing home-quality titles fully on the go. We're talking games that you'll even find on a PS5 or Xbox Series X. To start this off, yes, the Nintendo Switch is worth buying in 2022 without hesitation, even if a better console is released within the next couple years. I'm gonna have timestamps in the description below if you'd like to skip ahead in this review. Because the Switch is so worth buying, we're gonna be mostly focusing on which Switch you should buy, though I'll be very briefly touching on the Switch Lite as I did a full dedicated review for that device, and you can find a link to that in the description below. I think most people looking to buy a Switch are going to be torn between the OLED model and then the regular Switch. The OLED model being $350, the regular $300, and while they're fairly similar, we will be looking at the differences. But hey, I'll tell you right off the bat, the OLED model is probably more worth it at only $50 more. Now, it might be a bit harder to find the OLED Switch right now, but I will have Amazon affiliate links to all the Switches in the description if you want to check those out. At the moment, they all seem to be available, although that could change at any point. They're especially hard to find during peak seasons like Christmas, but if you keep diligent, it's not like the PS5, they are actually possible to find. And that regular Switch's value is a bit questionable to me. For $300, you can also get the Xbox Series S or the Oculus Quest 2, both of which are consoles, if you consider the Quest a console, that I think are probably more worth it than the Switch, at least in terms of value. But there's no question that the Switch has its place in the market, and I think more people would rather have a Switch than those two machines, even if it maybe should be cheaper. I think Nintendo probably should have lowered the price by now, and at $350, only $50 more, I think the OLED Switch is just the one to go for. But of course, that original Switch is still perfectly fine too, especially if you find it on sale somehow. Good luck with that, but hey, you might, and if you do, it's definitely worth buying. Even at $300, it is worth buying. I think the OLED model, though, it's just a little bit more worth it. So let's just get into this, and to clarify on the possibility of a better Nintendo system coming out, the good news here is that while a Nintendo Switch Pro has been rumored for years, the actual Switch itself shouldn't be going anywhere anytime soon. They just released a Switch OLED late 2021, so that's a good sign, and the Switch Pro would likely be similar to the PS4 Pro or Xbox One X, meaning every Switch will play all the same games as they already do, and even better, the price for the current Switch likely won't even change, but instead the Pro would be more expensive. The Switch has been extremely successful for Nintendo, and they have no interest in leaving it behind anytime soon. If you somehow haven't already jumped on board the Switch bandwagon, it's certainly not too late, and without hesitation, I'd recommend a Switch for anybody and everybody who has some interest in it. There are those certain things that the Switch does best of any console, and things that it doesn't do so well. It can play Nintendo titles like Mario or Zelda, of course, which is a huge selling point, and another big one is co-op games, but it also has that switching functionality that lets you play anywhere. This versatility actually makes the Switch a really good second console. If you normally play games on PC or already have, say, a PS4, PS5, then getting a Switch really gives you the best of all worlds. You just can't get that Nintendo experience, especially portably, on any other machine. Now keep in mind, the downside of getting a Switch is that you are limited in graphical potential. The hardware is nowhere near a PS5 or Xbox Series X, and it's not even really close to a PS4 or Xbox One. And so while a lot of the same games do come to Switch anyways, they're generally very downgraded in the graphics department, and at the moment, you can't play past 1080p. That being said, any game that comes from Nintendo generally looks really good. Games like Zelda Breath of the Wild or Mario Odyssey, while they're not in the highest resolution, the art style and the colors and everything just make it still look fantastic, whether on the big screen or the small. And it's also, without a doubt, the best system when it comes to playing with friends. Split screen gaming on other consoles just really isn't a thing anymore, or couch co-op or whatever you want to call it, but the Switch does it really well in playing Smash Brothers with friends, or Mario Party, or Mario Kart, or whatever. It's just an experience you're not getting anywhere else. The Switch is worth it in 2022, and no doubt it'll be worth it in 2023 as well. It's not too pricey, though keep in mind that games rarely go on sale, meaning you'll likely end up dumping decent money into the system regardless of what you spend initially. And you'll probably spend even more than that because games keep coming out for the Switch. There's no shortage of fun coming down the road, which isn't a bad thing, but it is bad for the wallet. And if you plan to download games, you are going to want a micro SD card, which can be put into any of the Switch models. So let's go ahead and take a look at those Switch models and see exactly which one is right for you. There are 3 models to choose from: the $200 Switch Lite, the $300 Switch, and then the $350 OLED Switch. Keep in mind that whichever Switch you get, they can all play the same games. The Switch Lite stands out from the group as being significantly cheaper, but also compromising the most, as it can only be played in handheld mode, meaning you aren't able to plug it into a dock to play on your TV. You can't buy a dock separately. It's just literally impossible to play the Switch Lite on your TV. This is the perfect console to get if you already have a normal Switch in your household and want another one for an individual. Otherwise, I'm always going to recommend one that can actually switch, as the ability to go from the TV to portably is what makes the system so special. It makes a Switch a Switch. And even if you think you don't need that functionality, there's a good chance you'll end up regretting that down the road. That $300 Switch is the next tier up, and this is what comes to mind when you think of the Switch. It's the standard model. Though technically released in 2019, this Switch looks the same as the original model released back in 2017, and comes with the dock to connect to your TV, 2 Joy-Cons, and a grip to place the Joy-Cons on for a more familiar controller experience. You can buy a charging grip that'll charge your controllers while you play, and there's also a Switch Pro controller, also not included, but you can buy that if you'd rather have something closer to what you would on Xbox or PlayStation. I especially like it for games like Zelda Breath of the Wild. For me, it just feels a bit more natural. But I don't really have too many complaints with the Joy-Cons. They're pretty great. They simply slide on and off the Switch itself, which is basically just like a tablet, and there's really not a whole lot more to it. It's not too thick, it isn't heavy, you've got an SD card slot just like on other Switch models, the USB-C charging on the bottom, this not so great kickstand, there's a headphone jack, although now with Bluetooth, which is something the Switch has always had. Nintendo has finally made it possible to use Bluetooth headphones. This was in an update last year, so finally you can connect your AirPods or whatever to your Switch, and it's about darn time. Of course, the main focus is always going to be on that 6.2-inch LCD touchscreen. It's slightly larger than the Switch Lite and is fairly chunky with the bezels, but it still looks nice enough, and what's on the display is really more important anyhow. The resolution is 1280 by 720, making for a pixel density of 236 pixels per inch. This is significantly less than what you'll find on most flagship smartphones nowadays, but it's not too far off from like an iPad, and on this fairly small display, it's not too bad. It's not an ideal spec sheet, and something like 1080p would be really nice in an eventual Pro model, but when you're actually using the system and playing games, it really doesn't look bad at all. Things look fairly sharp, and 720p is a necessary compromise when it comes to a small device like this in order to accommodate for at least half a decent battery life when games are running on the TV. Generally, we get 1080p, taking advantage of the constant flow of power. Battery life is nothing to write home about, but it's much better than it was on the original 2017 model. The only advantage of that original Switch is that it can be homebrewed without too much trouble, and I'll leave that to you to look into if you're curious. I actually have the original Switch. Me and my brother got it for the Christmas of 2017, but I'll generally be referring to it as if it was the newer one because they don't look different. They are fairly different on the inside though. In August 2019, Nintendo started selling a newer revision of the console, only identifiable by the model numbers, or more simply, the color of the retail box. The original Switch came in a white box, the new one comes in a red box, and this makes it pretty simple to figure which is which. The first Switch tends to last approximately 2.5 to 6.5 hours of gameplay, according to Nintendo's website, whereas the 2019 model lasts a much longer 4.5 to 9 hours. Of course, battery life will vary greatly depending on which game you're playing, and something like Breath of the Wild is going to drain it very quickly. But even so, that's a big difference, and it was also the biggest change. The revised Switch also has a slightly brighter display, a technically upgraded processor. Performance is pretty much the same, but it does help with the battery life, just better optimized, and the first Nintendo Switch is still fine if you have it. My family has it, and unless you're having battery drain issues, at this point, I wouldn't bother upgrading. Even with the OLED Switch, there really isn't an upgrade yet. Maybe if a Pro Switch comes out, that's something to go for, but for now, you're fine. The biggest issue you very well could experience over time doesn't even really have to do with the Switch itself, but instead the controllers. And yeah, we have to talk about it. It's just too common. Let's take a minute here and go over the infamous, dreaded Joy-Con drift. I absolutely hate Joy-Con drift and how Nintendo has seemingly done so little about it, though they do have a repair program. To explain drift as simply as possible, maybe your character is moving on the screen in a direction you're not actually moving it. Maybe it looks like you should be pointing your analog stick left, but you're not even touching it. That's drift. In some games, it's luckily not a major issue, but in more competitive titles like Super Smash Bros., having your character randomly walk or run in the opposite direction is a huge pain, and in my own friend group has caused all of us at some point to throw ourselves off a cliff multiple times, really. It's extremely annoying. It does give us a nice excuse when we lose, but even so, it's a pain to deal with. And drift is an issue that can happen on any Joy-Con or even to the Switch Lite and its attached controls, which is especially bad as those can't be simply slid on and off. While my Switch Lite hasn't had any drift as of yet, I can say the majority of my own and my family's Joy-Con controllers, along with my friends' controllers, have all started to suffer from drift over time. There really isn't any particular cause to drift, it just kind of happens, leaving you in a situation to either deal with it or look into Nintendo's repair program. Now, I haven't done this, but at joyconrepair.nintendo.com, there's a form where you can fill out your information, mail out the controllers, and then wait for Nintendo to do their magic. They'll either repair your controller or send you a replacement, and although the process will likely take several weeks, at the end of it you should end up with fully working Joy-Cons. And they don't charge a thing, meaning it's all free. This is a nice program, and it took way too long for Nintendo to implement it, but I'd highly recommend going through the trouble of doing it if you've been having issues. I myself haven't done it yet, but am planning to. After all, what can it hurt, right? The worst thing is losing your controllers for 4 to probably 8 weeks, possibly longer, possibly shorter, but if you have multiple pairs of Joy-Cons, you should be okay. Now, there are supposed fixes that you can find online that have you trying to kind of DIY a fix for Joy-Con drift. Some of them seem legit, some of them don't. The ones that should actually fix it involve taking apart your controller, which I don't really recommend unless you're very comfortable with what you're doing. And a lot of other fixes are really basic stuff that probably won't help, such as compressed air and those sorts of things. We won't spend all day here talking about drift, but I did want to take some time for it, as it's one of the most prominent issues when it comes to a Switch, and one that basically everyone's dealt with at this point. It's terrible. So just keep it in mind if you're purchasing a Switch or currently own one. But back to the subject on hand. We are still talking about whether or not the Switch is worth it, or more specifically, which Switch is worth it for you. I think we've probably covered enough of the standard models, so let's take a look at the next step up and how it compares. Here we have the Nintendo Switch OLED model, a very, very catchy name. This only came out in late 2021 and was a bit disappointing for those hoping for a Switch Pro, and while it's certainly an upgrade in a few areas, it's not any more powerful. The benefit to this, however, is that it's also only $50 more than the normal Switch, putting it at $350, and honestly, that's not at all bad for what you get. To summarize what you get here, you get a more vibrant display in OLED, you get 64 gigabytes in built-in storage versus 32, you get the updated dock, which is white, has some padding inside, and has an Ethernet port, you get a much better kickstand, the speakers have gotten significantly better, and those are kind of the basics. If you already have a Switch, you don't need the OLED model. I bought it for review, but do as I say and not as I do in this case, as while it's got those nice benefits, it's really not that much different. However, it's nice for those of us who haven't jumped on the Switch train yet and want something a little bit sleeker than the original model. The biggest upgrade is the display, being 7 inches now with thinner bezels, making it look quite a bit more modern than the normal Switch, albeit still with that 720p resolution. The screen is of course OLED, which differs from LCD in being able to actually turn off individual pixels and thus have true blacks. This means the OLED model can produce a much more vivid, vibrant, and eye-popping image, which looks really nice, especially with the colorful and flashy games Nintendo loves to put out. Note that this will have zero benefit when it's played on the TV. The drawback of the larger 7-inch screen is that because we still have the 720p resolution, the pixel density is actually even lower on the OLED Switch than it is on the normal Switch. The normal Switch doesn't look noticeably sharper to my eye, maybe a little bit, but the smaller Switch Lite with the highest pixel density of the bunch is definitely the most crispy. Honestly, I'd still take the OLED model any day of the week for the colors and larger display, but it's worth noting all the same. The improvements this model brings for only $50 more really does make it worth it over the regular model at this point for me, unless you're finding that original model on sale, which you probably won't. It's just better value, and while the normal Switch is still a great machine, I'm a tad annoyed. It's $300 5 years after it launched. It's basically the same as it's ever been, or in the very least since 2019. And as said at the beginning of the video, considering the Xbox Series S or the Oculus Quest 2 is also $300, that Switch just doesn't look like the greatest value, but it does make the OLED Switch look better. And ultimately, whatever price you pay is going to be worth it in order to access the Nintendo experience. The fact that you can play in handheld or docked modes, these home console games, it's still mind-blowing to me. It really is. My favorite game of all time has always been Skyrim, and I got it when I was about 12, I think 2012, 2012, and if you had told me that I could be playing that game portably 10 years later, I wouldn't believe you, much less 5 years later, and yet here we are. Besides, I guess, a laptop, and I still haven't bought Skyrim on my Switch because I don't think I've ever seen it on sale. And that's kind of another problem with the Switch in general. The games just don't go on sale. It pains me that 2017 titles like Mario Kart or Skyrim still go for like $60 most of the time. The most recent Black Friday, I did see some of the older titles go down a little bit in price, but it was like $20 off. But it is what it is, and the wide selection of titles you have right now will keep you entertained indefinitely. A half decade down the road, the game library has gotten absolutely massive, and it just keeps expanding. You should buy a Switch if you haven't already, and the OLED model is probably the one to go for. Or if your household already has a Switch, that Switch Lite is kind of the perfect device for a secondary Switch. So with that, I think I'm right about done here. I doubt anyone really expected the Switch to not be worth buying, but it's interesting to me how good value the OLED Switch seems. This new one does feel like a more modern Switch. The smaller bezels really does help, even if the actual upgrades are fairly minimal. Hopefully this video was able to help you out, and if it did, make sure you hit that like button and consider subscribing if you're into tech. Thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. And with that all being said, I'm Josh from 91 Tech, and I will see you all next time.